so much for that generous introduction. I will share my screen. All right, thank you everyone for participating today. I do want to honor the fact that I am in France, and I welcome you to intervene in French. I was unsure whether I would be speaking in French or English today, but the last word I heard was that it would be in English. So I've prepared my slides in English, and therefore I think my brain would not work if I were speaking in French and reading in English, and so I'll present in English, but I will endeavor to slow down to accommodate anyone who might find this cognitively taxing. I see that I have a bar here that's probably going to distract people. So let me see if I can like hide that. Oh, it's still there. Does anyone know how I get rid of this? Hide thumbnail.
Full screen. Have an option for full screen.
I am on full screen.
Okay, so it's okay.
If it's in the bottom, maybe it's not too obtrusive. I think it's fine for now. If it cuts off words, then I might pause to try and fix that. All right, so as you heard, the title of my book is Political Protest in Contemporary Africa. This book came out a number of years ago, in 2018 to be precise, and so it's already quite dated. As my colleague pointed out today, and I wholeheartedly agree, many of you are aware that a lot has unfolded in Africa on the protest scene. And so I welcome you in the question and answer period to contribute any more recent anecdotes, any up-to-date knowledge that you think might complement or even challenge what I'm about to say. All right, so I want to introduce by way of talking about how I started this project. This is a question that people often ask me, in particular, given my positionality. I am American. I am not African. So people, especially my students, ask, Professor Mueller, how did you get started on this line of research? And my interest in the politics of Africa goes very far back, but my interest in protest in particular, I can date to around 2008, when I was in Conakry in Guinea, trying to choose a dissertation question. And this will be a challenge familiar to many of the graduate students present today. It's seldom that inspiration just strikes you and you suddenly have the question that can sustain your 8 years of hard labor. We were discussing this at lunch. And so I went to Guinea to really do exploratory research and just wait for information to strike. And as fate would have it, the now infamous coup unfolded days after I arrived. So this was in September of 2008, a year before the picture that you see on the slide. For anyone who's not familiar with this event, in the months after the military took over the government, suspended the Constitution, and promised to hold free and fair elections, the leaders reneged on those promises, refusing to hold the elections they had committed to hold. And in response, countless Ghanaian citizens took to the streets and then flooded the National Football Stadium in downtown Conakry, demanding their democratic rights and the free election. The military opened fire on these peaceful protesters, murdering people in broad daylight, hiding bodies to deflate the death count. It was a very gruesome event that drew international criticism. And I felt very personally connected to this tragedy because I had experienced the precipitating coup in the company of my Ghanaian friends, and I had to flee the country. And it was this very viscerally, emotionally turbulent experience that connected me to the politics of protest in a highly personal way. And it was at that point that I felt like I could not ignore this question of why some Ghanaians risked their lives on that day of the massacre to demand their democratic rights, whereas many others stayed home. I was very curious about the calculus in one's mind of when is it worth facing mortal danger to demand democracy. And so that led to the motivating question for my project, which is why do some people protest and others do not? And I really wanted to answer that question in the context of West Africa, but Africa more broadly. And as you'll see, for kind of practical and intellectual reasons, I ended up looking farther afield from Guinea. I looked more to the Sahel, but the origins, the genesis of this project go back to that year in Guinea. By the way, I'm used to presenting in a very interactive format. I don't know if that would like catch people off guard or make people uncomfortable, but if anyone wants to intervene with questions while I'm talking, I absolutely welcome you to do that. I don't know if that's practical on Zoom or not, but if you see people raising their hand or something, feel free to use the raise hand feature, and your question will reach me one way or another. But as much as I love hearing myself talk, I really much prefer talking with all of you. All right, so that's the origins of this project. So when I zoomed out from Guinea, I noticed that the trend of protests, of rising participation in protests, was really Africa-wide. It was not unique to this moment in Guinean political history. And we can see that really starkly on this graph, which plots the frequency of major, basically meaning newspaper-worthy protests across sub-Saharan Africa from 1997 to 2016, which is right when I was writing my book. And so this is one of those outdated slides that I warned you about before. And I mean, I have terrible eyesight, but even if I were not wearing my glasses, there would be no question that there is a conspicuous leap in the frequency of protests continent-wide, starting around end of 2010, 2011. And so whenever there is huge and obvious variation, political scientists want to explain it. So already, this project has two related puzzles. One is, why do individual people protest whereas others do not? And this is at the event level of, why do protests start when they do? And why do they occur more frequently in some periods than in others? So let me put a question to you all, and this can either be a rhetorical question or one that someone actually answers. I would prefer if someone could chime in and answer it, because that'll keep people awake. What do you intuit is the reason for this jump in protest frequency? Knowing what you know, this is not a quiz. I'm not trying to test you in any stressful way, but based on your, either folk wisdom or prior studies of this period in history, what might have explained this jump in protest frequency?
Was it the Arab Spring? I can't remember the date.
That's a great question, or a great suggestion. Yeah, so many people look at that date, 2011, and their minds instantly go to the Arab Spring, right? Le Printemps Arabe, which was contemporaneous, simultaneous with this jump in protest. By the way, I should have noted, this picture depicts data only from sub-Saharan Africa. So this is separate from the Arab Spring. But some people indeed thought—
This graph is only sub-Saharan Africa.
This is only sub-Saharan Africa, yes. So some people looked at this picture and said, aha, maybe this is the Arab Spring trickling down to sub-Saharan countries. This may be a sub-Saharan spring. And journalists would sometimes quote protesters in Dakar, in Cape Town, in Blantyre, in Kinshasa, saying, these activists in North Africa and the Middle East have profoundly inspired us. You sometimes heard them echoing the protest slogans, like instead of "Dégage Ben Ali," they would say "Dégage fill in the blank" of a sub-Saharan African leader who had tried to outstay his mandate. It was a very common narrative. Another common narrative was that people in sub-Saharan Africa were rising up because of the high cost of living. In other words, some people said these are bread riots. And here is, I know we have a Mozambique scholar in the room, right? This was a period when prices of basic commodities and fuel, food were skyrocketing in many parts of the continent. And so naturally, people will take to the streets and demand subsidies or price reductions or something. These were the two main explanations for the pattern that you saw in that picture. I had this inclination, though, that those two narratives were not mutually exclusive, that African protests could be at the same time democratic revolutions and bread riots. And let me explain how this can be true. So on the one hand, Africa had a rising middle class. And because I know that some of my colleagues here at LAM, especially Dominique Darbon, who's not here right now, I don't think, but whose work on the middle classes in Africa has greatly inspired me, I needed to come up with a working definition for middle class. And my imperfect working definition is the stratum of Africans who meet their basic material needs with income from sources outside the state. And that non-state source of income is going to be very politically important, as you'll see. And this was a time when that middle class was expanding. And people in that middle class were often desiring political influence commensurate with their newfound economic power. On the other hand, the poor desired better material conditions, right? And so when we see people demanding democracy, we're often seeing members of that rising middle class saying, hey, we want a say in the government. And this is not the first time historically when this has taken place. Iconic examples include the Glorious Revolution in Britain, right, where you had this rising middle class that was no longer willing to tolerate the monarch just monopolizing all political power. So they're standing up for democracy. But that middle class, although it is expanding, is still a tiny proportion of most African populations. The majority of people remain at a very low level of income. And for those people, the high cost of living is much more salient. And so you have a convergence of these two main economic classes protesting together, but for different reasons. And for that reason, you can have a bread riot and a democratic revolution in the same crowd at the same time. Does that make sense? Are there any questions about that? Okay. I am deliberately using the language of class, by the way. This is one of the contributions that I hoped to make with this book, because for many of you, I don't know actually what the conventional wisdom is in French academia, but in the United States, many people who study African politics have assumed or argued outright that class is an irrelevant category of identity and politics in Africa because most African societies are so-called pre-industrial, that any kinds of Marxian theories, for example, about workers and the owners of the means of production and capital can only go so far to explain African politics because those are not really relevant categories. I very much disagree with that conventional wisdom because I understand class in a more expansive way, not in a classical Marxist sense, but more along the lines of, say, Richard Sklar, if anyone's familiar with him, who defined class in Africa as access to the means of what did he say? Does anyone know the quote? Access to the means of power as opposed to the means of production. That's how he said it. And so that's why I'm using this class language. And it might not convince all of you. I realize this is one of the most precarious and controversial aspects of my book. And some reviews have disagreed with me. And I think that's fine. I look forward with this book to sparking debates, even disagreement about the role of class in African politics. Okay, but to get back to my core theory, you have these two narratives at once, and the reason why we see both middle class and working class or poor people, not all of them, most of them are not salary earners, but why you see poor and relatively better off people protesting together is because they need each other to form minimum winning coalitions in the jargon of political science. So the middle class, if the middle class took to the streets by itself, this would just be a blip on the radar, a drop in the bucket. Sorry, I'm relying on American colloquialisms, but it would not make a big difference because there are not enough of them. There would be maybe 200 people in, the Place de l'Obélisque in Dakar, and that wouldn't catch much attention. On the other hand, the poor often lack the mobilizational resources to pull together, to assemble, to coordinate a mass uprising. They might not have access to the education they need to be effective communicators. They might lack the financial or material resources to, say, pay for publicity, because many of these protests involved commissioned TV coverage or internet coverage. And so the middle class reaches out to the lower classes in order to gain the foot power, to gain these bodies in the streets. And then the members of the lower classes are able to benefit through these coalitions from the higher resource access of the middle class. Okay, that was a lot of theory at once. Any questions? Yes, please.
First, I would like to know if you, this structure of the project, you say, so as I understand, the middle class is the protagonist, and then you have the incorporation of the poor classes. What I want to ask is, for example, how these different protests in different areas, what is the trigger? What triggers it? Because you say, okay, Guinea-Bissau was a coup. But in other places, how is the development? It's always in this kind of model, first the middle class that reach to the poor, because as you describe, it seems a little bit like a premeditation, as everyone knows exactly what is their places. But how this develops in a more spontaneous way, or it's completely organized from the start?
Thank you for your question. Yeah. So one of the hallmarks, one of the major ideas in the social movement and protest literature is that grievances are universal. Like if I asked you all to raise your hands right now, actually, let me just do this. Like this is what I do with my students. So let's loosen up. Raise your hand if there is some issue. It could be political, economic, moral, anything that really makes you angry. I'll be the first to raise my hand. Anything, like anything at all. Anything you want to see change in the world. All right. Okay. So we don't have anyone who's just Pollyanna. I'm like resorting to all these Americanisms just because it's like, I'm trying not to. Yeah, so everyone is upset about something. And I don't mean to trigger your anxiety, but I want to set up my next question. Now raise your hand. And those of you who are not here physically, you can do this just in your minds. Now raise your hand if you have protested in a meaningful way about that concern in the last 12 months. We have a couple of revolutionaries here, but we have a bunch of slackers, right? Oh, blame COVID. Good job, Victoria. Yeah. Hey, okay, I'm from Minneapolis, Minnesota. In the heat, in the thick of COVID, people were protesting against the murder of George Floyd, right? So I use that as an excuse, and then I can no longer use that excuse. Okay, I'm joking with you, obviously. But I'm using this informal survey to illustrate a point in response to your question, which is that at any given moment, everyone is aggrieved, everyone has concerns, everyone is pissed off about something, but very seldom do we see major protests break out, right? That is why protests like the Arab Spring, like the so-called Sub-Saharan Spring, like the George Floyd protests, like name your protest, capture so much media and public attention because they are rare events. And so it struck early social scientists as bizarre. Why wouldn't people stand up more often? And that's where you get the whole canon about mobilization goods. And you don't just need the will to protest, you also need the way, you need the means. And you also need a trigger, right? Because you can be pissed off about the same thing, right, at a latent kind of steady level for a long time, but then something can raise the salience of those concerns. So for someone who is, say, upset about the state of democracy, right, they might constantly be upset about it, but then the president announces that he's not going to obey term limits. Oh, and then that triggers you to stand up, right? And in my book, I do insinuate that it's often the middle class who are the first movers because they have those means to move first. And because these political triggers were unfolding at that time. But it's more complicated than that because as you'll see as my argument unfolds, the savviest, the smartest, the most strategic members of that first moving middle class would incorporate the grievances of the lower classes into their movement. So they would make their actions not just about political violations by like a dictator, but they would also make it about food prices or something like that. So the grievances could meet, but usually the first movers are the ones who can accept that risk, right? Because it's not just about having resources that you deploy in your protest, but it's also having the insurance that if things go wrong, you're going to be okay. And if you are living on the cusp of starvation, right? I mean, and that's how Collier, the economist, refers to extreme poverty. This is poverty that kills, right? You cannot so easily risk it all to be one of those first movers, right? In the US, we say use your privilege, right? Like if you have a lot of privilege, many resources, then you can be out on the front lines in the streets first, right? And this is a generalization. This is not always how it happened. There are, of course, like very grassroots poor people's movements, particularly some that I mentioned in the book are in like South Africa. But oftentimes you need, I mean, in the kind of Marxist literature sense, like a vanguard. You kind of need that vanguard. Yes.
Yes, but I try to make a comparison with the Arab Springs. In the two main explosions and huge mobilization in Tunisia and Egypt, the first people who organized were not the bourgeoisie and not the middle class. They were workers who had previous experience in Tunisia and in Egypt. And the middle class and the urban classes join in the second day when they lose the fear and they say, we have an opportunity to provoke an aggregation of people and agendas. But the first activists were people with previous experience, which is quite different. Then I'm thinking, is it possible to generalize, or is it a special form of mobilization?
Thank you for reminding me to make a point I really wanted to earlier. So what you pointed out is what I understand to be an accurate account of the Arab Spring. And it's a reason why the comparison between the Arab Spring and the so-called Sub-Saharan Spring breaks down, because the composition of the crowds in those two theaters was very different. So in the Arab Spring, and indeed in major uprisings almost everywhere else in the world, there is a critical mass of middle-class protesters, or if not middle class, then people who would be middle class by the economic standards of many sub-Saharan countries, right? And so the early movers in a place like Cairo, many of them were like disaffected students, right? So they're not, like bourgeois in the sense that they're like salaried and comfortable, right? Like they are maybe the floating, like they're an aspiring middle class, but they have much more access to resources, material and informational and cultural, or like in terms of cultural capital, like connections, than the typical protester in a much lower income country, right? And so there's more, this is where I go back to my working definition of middle class. Like middle class is a very slippery term. And so when we talk about the middle class in like Egypt, it's a fundamentally kind of different phenomenon than a middle class like in Malawi, right? The material access is just very different. But anytime that I generalize, there are always the caveats that accompany that. Absolutely. Did I answer your question adequately? Yeah? Okay. And oh, one more thing on the difference between the Arab Spring and sub-Saharan protests is that, in a sense, sub-Saharan African countries, many of them, the majority of them, experienced their African Spring a generation before, right? So if we're thinking in terms of democratization, there was a much longer experience with democratic government in many African countries that were rising up than in North African and Middle East countries. And so it really is kind of an apples and oranges comparison at the end of the day. Yes.
I am an old Marxist, and for me, middle class doesn't mean anything. But I understand what you want to say. But one slide was about the riot in Maputo, Mozambique in 2000. Yes, this one. And this one is a good example where middle class did not join the poor. In 2008 and 2010, the same. And there is in Maputo, there are in Maputo sometimes protests of middle class with go and so on. A few hundred persons, no more. And this one, several thousand of people, and they failed. And then perhaps what is true that a better chance to have a success is when there is how to say that in English?
Coalition.
The coalition, perhaps not because it's not organized, but now in the reality, when middle class and the people are going joining, yes, perhaps because I think it's the same thing in France. When we had 2 years ago our Gilets jaunes. Our Gilets jaunes, it was not exactly a worker class phenomenon, but perhaps the last protest of the tiers état. And middle class didn't join. They obtained something, but with a hard repression, with 36 people without their hand and without their eyes. I don't know if you can, even for sub-Saharan Africa, it's complicated it's always complicated to try to find a rule.
Absolutely. And I thank you for the details on the Mozambican case, because it was just by chance that I chose this headline. It's about a country that I know almost nothing about. I'm very ignorant about its politics. So I'm glad to know that maybe it's an exceptional case, or it's an example that kind of complicates the message that I'm sending here. But you're right that some protest leaders were better at forming cross-class coalitions than others. And so this is going to end up having an influence on the success of those movements. And I'll talk about that in a moment in the Senegalese context, but thank you for that point. Okay. Not to be too formulaic and lay out my whole scientific method, but I do want to just give you a snapshot, a summary of the methods that I use to answer my research questions. And so remember, there are these two related puzzles. One is about why protests happened when they did, which is fundamentally a function of protest leaders starting protests, initiating the action. And to examine that, I mainly used interviews and historical analysis of protest leaders in Senegal, Niger, Burkina Faso, Kenya, and Malawi. And the interviews were helpful because interviews are great when you have a small number of people that you want to study, because you can maximize the detail, but you don't need to interview 3,000 people because the people who lead protests are very few, right? These are the rare, kind of risk-taking, entrepreneur, protest entrepreneurs. So I did these in-depth interviews in a few countries. And then to explain participation or why some people join the protest whereas others don't. Remember, this was the question that really concerned me after witnessing the Guinea coup. I used statistical analyses that are ideal for studying many, many more people. And I drew very heavily on the Afrobarometer data that I'm sure are familiar to many of you. But then I also complemented those data with an original survey that I conducted in Niamey in the aftermath of the protests surrounding Mamadou Tanja's attempt to outstay his mandate, known as Tazarche in Hausa. All right. So I'm going to give a little historical context because I don't know if we have any historians in the room, but I have always welcomed the criticism from historians that political science is often ahistorical, and we forget that events happened longer than 20 years ago. So I want to contextualize a bit protests in Africa over the longer term. And in general, there were three main periods of protests distinguished by certain characteristics. So the first one was on the eve of independence for most but not all countries, and the early independence period. And one of the main traits of this wave of protests is that you had some protest leaders who were making rather conservative claims, actually. And Senegal is one of the iconic example of this, where you had people, you had members of the civil service, right? Senegalese members of the civil service who were interested in raising their status within the existing colonial system rather than overturning that system. And this prevented those cross-class coalitions because, you know, as immortalized in Sembène Ousmane novels, right, you had the lower classes, like the railway workers, right, and les bouts de bois de Dieu, right, who were hoping that the middle class would help them, would form coalitions with them, and that often never occurred. Actually, in that novel, there is solidarity, but in reality, that didn't actually happen. Actually, not very often, at least. Then, during the 70s and 80s, we would have expected to see another wave of protests because this is when many African economies were tanking. There was economic stagnation or worse, and yet we didn't see a huge swell of protests, and that seems to be because repression was so severe that just, you know, as soon as any unrest began, dictators would suppress it. Instead, we had to really wait until the 1990s to see another major wave of protests in sub-Saharan Africa, coinciding with democratic transitions. This is that earlier African Spring that I mentioned in response to a question before. And the third wave that is still ongoing is the one that I showed you in that graph that opened the presentation. It's still unfolding as we talk. And because it is so new, not many people really knew how to explain it. And so that's what my book is trying to achieve. All right, so that's just a little historical context to deflect any mean comments from historians. All right.
Only to tease you.
Please.
Missing waves in the 70s and 80s, not in South Africa.
Right. So this is aggregate, right? There are absolutely really important exceptions to this. Yes. Thank you. All right. So now let's zoom forward to the present. There are two paradoxes that I think underlie, help explain the third wave of African protests. And they relate to the distribution of class affiliation that I was describing before. So the first is that incomes have been rising, but they've been distributed very unequally. I mean, that's a long-winded way of saying that there's a lot of inequality in Africa. And this has led to many aggrieved poor people who feel like they're being left behind in the course of economic development, right? At the same time, this rising prosperity has not translated into political power for the people in the middle class who now feel like they deserve it. And so this has led the middle class to also be aggrieved, but they're often, not always, angry for different reasons than people who are much worse off economically, right? But everyone's pissed off about something, right? So this is why we all raised our hands when I asked you earlier, right? What upsets you? Something, right? And because I'm a political scientist who wants to be an economist, I have to show you some quantitative data to substantiate what I just said. And so this is a really simple way of seeing that there has been historic economic growth on average, right? Again, with major exceptions in sub-Saharan Africa over this period preceding the third wave of protest. It's really historic, and scholars have written very optimistic books about this. Like Steve Radlett is one that you might have heard of. Like, was it Africa or Emerging Africa? Right. There's this whole narrative. Like when I was studying African politics, there was a lot, or as a student, and I don't know if any of you have experienced this, there was a lot of Afro-pessimism in the curriculum, right? Like, Africa is doomed, their economies are like retracting hopelessly, and it's just this kind of inevitable pathway to financial ruin. And then rather suddenly, and this is a really kind of abrupt change, the narrative shifted to reflect these rising incomes. And now suddenly Africa is the new frontier, economically speaking. There is so much economic hope. The Economist magazine famously had these like contradicting cover stories. One was like, Africa's doomed. The other one was like, Africa, the continent of hope. And like, it's the same magazine with like a few years apart. And it was very exciting, right? Unfortunately, this did not benefit all people in Africa equally. And like, I'm sure this doesn't surprise any of you here, but I think it bears mentioning given the influence of those optimistic narratives. Someone told me in Bamako, you can't eat growth, right? Like, oh, great, our GDP per capita is looking very promising, but like my dinner table has not changed at all, right? You can't eat growth. In Bamako, I've also heard people say you can't eat monuments. On ne peut pas manger les monuments. Like there are monuments everywhere, and it's like this like waste of resources, right? So you can have a lot of growth in a country, and none of it is trickling down to the bottom, and this is fueling economic grievances among the poor. And this just supports my point about high inequality. So this shows inequality measured by the Gini coefficient in 3 main time periods. And in all time periods, Africa, on the whole, averaged across countries, has higher economic inequality than any region besides Latin America, right? So there is this optimism and pessimism coinciding. All right, and finally, like, we don't need to belabor the details of this, but I just wanted to show that one offshoot, one consequence of this rising aggregate development was increased access to credit for private sector members. So for that rising middle class, it was increasingly possible to rely on the market instead of the state. So if you had a middle class lifestyle in, as late as like the early to mid 90s, you probably were a civil servant, right? In many, but not all African contexts, but you probably were on the government's payroll. And that creates clear conflicts of interest, like limiting your ability to speak out against that government. But with the influx of private capital, with the enhanced availability of credit in the private sector, now you had an autonomous middle class increasingly that could launch protests against the state. Questions about that? Right, that was the economistic segment of my talk. Okay.
Well, the other side of that really
Yeah.
would be the structural adjustment policies that were forced on a lot of African governments to basically demolish their public sector employment.
Yes.
So whether there was enough private capital around or not, people were pushed.
Right. Yeah. So the book talks about that by way of explaining this picture, right? Like, how did we get here?
Yeah.
It was not like accidental. It was not even chosen in many cases on a domestic level. It was it was coerced by the Washington Consensus, basically. Yeah, that's a really important piece of context, Victoria.
So maybe 10 minutes, maybe it's okay for you.
Sorry?
10 minutes.
10 minutes? Absolutely. Yeah, that sounds great. Okay, so I want to make sure we all leave as friends. So I'm going to stop overwhelming you with data and talk about some qualitative examples that illustrate my theory of protest leaders. So now I want to kind of elaborate on these, as I've termed them, first movers. They're not always the first movers, but they often are. And so this is actually a really terrible slide. I apologize. There's too much going on. But the left-hand side compares protest leadership in one country, in Senegal, over time. So I'm holding constant, in economistic statistical terms, I'm holding constant many factors that vary across countries, while seeing how protest leadership changed over time and how that in turn influenced the protest coalition. So in the first wave, remember I mentioned that on the earlier slide, you had this kind of half-hearted, tepid, like weak resistance to colonialism among certain members of the middle class. And I mentioned the Sembin novel before. In the second wave of protests in the 1990s, the focus shifted to one echoing like the kind of capitalists who emerged out of the like post-Berlin Wall moment, right? There was this ethos of individual, like the self-made person, rags to riches type stories. And Boule Falé was a major movement in Senegal at the time that really glorified that notion. And there were artists who would like mimic, especially American hip hop and like these kind of lyrics. I analyze hip hop lyrics in my book, and in that sense, I hope that this is one of the most methodologically like mixed books ever, because in one chapter there's a regression analysis and the next I'm doing ethnomusicology. But like it's really clear in their lyrics that they were like, you know, you can achieve your slice of that growth, right? So there was not yet that disaffection, that anger toward the inequality. People thought, well, if I just work hard enough, I can have my piece too. Over time, it became pretty clear that was not possible for most people. And so in the third wave, you see a major shift in the rhetoric of Senegalese protest leaders toward a more collectivist ethos that we all need to demand that the state take care of us, right? Like that we can't just be left behind. And so that enabled the cross-class coalitions, because now the protest leaders, at least the smart ones, like the leaders of Y'en a marre that I'm saying here, and I shouldn't say smart because that's a very like loaded word, but the savvy, strategic ones were saying, hey, you know, this is not your fault, right? Your impoverishment is not your fault, and we are here alongside you, demanding that the government be accountable to providing for your basic needs. And this is when the Y'en a marre movement was meeting with Barack Obama on Gorée Island in order to like really cultivate international solidarity for what they were trying to do. So there's this big shift over the decades in terms of the kinds of demands that you heard protest leaders issuing. And to respond to a comment I received, or a question I received earlier, not all of these strategies are equally successful at sustaining a movement or winning concessions. And some key illustrations of that would be some contemporary social movements in the last generation, in the third wave within Senegal. So the M23 movement coincided with Y'en a marre. These were both movements who were leading people into the streets in around 2011, 2012, like that same kind of big leaping off point for the third wave. In response to Abdoulaye Wade's interest in staying in power. But the M23 movement was composed mainly of former, current, or aspiring politicians who were really about like, let's defend democracy, let's fix the constitution. They weren't talking so much in terms of helping the poor. And so they failed ultimately to form those cross-class coalitions, and their movement fizzled. So when I was trying to interview members, like leaders of that movement, I was calling phone numbers, and people would say to me, "Oh, no, I don't do that anymore." I'm like, "I'm not, we disbanded this movement. It's just like, it's not a thing." Meanwhile, Y'en a marre continued to form coalitions with people like throughout the countryside, people at a subsistence level of living. They were really not just about saving the Constitution, because frankly, many poor people don't have the time to read the Constitution, right? They were also talking about jobs training and the access to education and really bread and butter issues. I have a Kenya case. I'm short on time, so I'm going to skip it, but it illustrates something similar. Okay. You've had a break from stats. I'm going to show you some more statistics. All right. This just shows the main findings from my Afrobarometer survey analysis of over 30 African countries. And these points represent the estimated relationship, you could say effect, but that's kind of a complicated term, of a given variable on whether or not someone protested in the last 12 months, right? Controlling for other factors. And the bars represent 95% confidence intervals. So if the bar overlaps with 0, we don't have very much confidence that the effect of that variable was any different than 0. Following more or less? Okay, I saw like, maybe, that's okay. So let me just point out the highlights. So relative deprivation has one of the larger effects on protest participation. And that means temporal relative deprivation. That means if you think that you are economically worse off today than you were in the past, all else equal, you're more likely to protest. So this is consistent with a theory that economic concerns are really driving many of the rank and file, the ordinary protesters, the poor people, to take to the streets, right? Another economic grievance that matters is low expectations of upward mobility. So if you think that in the future, your economic situation will be no better, then you're even more likely to take to the streets, right? It's a larger coefficient, a larger estimated net effect on protest participation. There is, if you've gone without income, up at the top, sorry, I'm jumping around, you're also more likely, all else told, to protest. There's some vindication of ethnic theories of politics in Africa. If you think that your ethnic group is treated unfairly, this also seems to increase the chances that you protest. But notice the low effects of state legitimacy, right? If this were really about most people protesting to save the Constitution, you would expect that their perceptions of state legitimacy would have a much larger effect, right? And so this is consistent with my theory that even though the early movers might be really upset with a state they regard as illegitimate, for the rank and file joiner of protests, what matters more is their economic situation and sometimes their ethnic grievances. Victoria?
I'm not good at statistics.
That's okay.
But I'm just wondering if something like state legitimacy may not vary as much. Like, what if most Senegalese just agree that the state is not, the leadership is not legitimate? So it's not maybe measuring the same thing as, like, somebody whose ethnic group is the dominant one and very privileged versus somebody whose ethnic group is the most marginalized and denigrated. I'm just wondering if that's why something like state legitimacy doesn't show an impact, because there's more agreement whether it doesn't vary. It could be a variable that doesn't vary as much.
So it does empirically, actually, but it does vary in some places more than others, and that's why it's important that this is a cross-national analysis. So this, and I can see why it might be confusing. So the earlier slide was only about Senegal, but these results reflect over 30 African countries, and there is substantial, I don't remember how much variation, like what the standard deviation of responses to the state legitimacy question was, but trust me that it's there. The threshold for removing a variable due to lack of variation is very high. It's usually 95% agreement, right? And it's way less than that. Like, there's a lot more variation, but your hunch is good. All right, any questions? Yeah.
I don't know how you manage to calculate such what's that? Gap, figure.
Yeah.
But I think it's very interesting. For example, ethnic group treated unfairly. It's the most important effect of protest. But it corresponds with
your former say about the confluence of medium class and poor, and ethnic group furnish the totality. And at the contrary, the absolute deprivation in any place in the whole world, the absolute deprivation never produce revolt.
Yeah, this reflects really classic theories about the relative importance of relative deprivation versus absolute. So yeah, you're right on that. Okay, so I'm about out of time.
So what I can say now is the best is that question to answer after
Sure.
your presentation.
Sure.
I believe it's more practical and more efficient.
I agree. Okay, so let me just conclude then. Is that all right?
Yes,
Yeah.
right.
Okay. I mean, I feel like we've kind of incorporated some questions and answers already, so I hope that hasn't eaten too much in the Q&A. All right. Then I'll just suffice it to say that I found the same thing in Niger. I don't want to cut short or like not do justice to the Niger case or the work I did there, but let me just say that not everyone who protested during Tazarche, during Mamadou Tanja's effort to stay for an extra third term, actually opposed him. I think it was like, I forget my stats, but it was like 30% actually supported his effort, but they nevertheless protested. Why? Because they also had economic grievances. So low expectations of upward mobility were also salient, important, mobilizing in Niger, just as they were in many other African countries. Yeah.
I don't know if you face the following phenomenon that I'm from Brazil. And in 2013, we had also a kind of spring of manifestations. And one of the very intriguing phenomena about these manifestations was that people were in the street, so you had huge thousands of people on the street, but people didn't really knew at first. They couldn't explain what were the real causes of their protests. It was maybe if you force them towards one direction or another, they will answer. But at first, every analyst would say that you have that impression that you have middle class and poor people, but it was a kind of strange situation where you couldn't find a common ground, or even people were not able to formulate which the grievances were. So I don't know if you found something like that in this protest, or the situation where the grievances are a product of the mobilization itself. They are not prior to the mobilization.
Yeah, good. So one response is that one person can harbor multiple grievances at once, which I'm sure all of you have experienced. Like when I asked you to raise your hand before, you might have been thinking, what does not fire me up right now? What does not piss me off right now? And that's why I use this analysis to show that multiple grievances can be salient at the same time. And then what else was I going to say? But in terms of being able to articulate our grievances, yeah, I mean, sometimes there are cognitive limits to our ability, which is why surveys are imperfect. If you ask people why they protested, like maybe they don't even know. So that's why I thought it was important to kind of use different methods, both kind of more ethnographic and more statistical methods, to kind of triangulate a little bit. Yeah. All right. So these slides are just like, this matters elsewhere. Okay. And then I'll just close it now and then take more questions. Is that all right?
Please.
Yeah.